Alright, what's going on everyone? And welcome to a new series on the channel where I introduce you to all the meta decks of the modern format. The purpose of these videos is not to give you an exact deck list, as those change constantly as new sets are released and also change from person to person based on their preferences, but rather to give you an overview of what a deck is doing so you can decide either if you like the deck yourself and want to build it yourself, or so you can be prepared to play against it if you decide to play the format. This is just an introductory series to one of my favorite formats. So today we're looking at Mono Green Tron, a deck that gets its name from a series of lands, the Urza lands or the Tron lands. They each add 1 mana each individually. However, if you control all 3 at once, you can generate 7 total mana. Also note that they aren't legendary, so you can control multiple copies of the same land. If you have assembled Tron and then draw an extra tower, you can play it and have 10 mana total. So what this means is on turn 3, you can have 7 mana to cast something like, say, Karn Liberated. This is a very powerful planeswalker, but normally can't hit the battlefield until the late game. But Tron isn't interested in waiting, so Karn has a ton of loyalty and his plus ability adds 4 more. So you can have a 10 loyalty planeswalker at the beginning of the game on turn 3, and then he starts blowing up permanents and ripping apart hands. That's the sort of power this deck is looking to unleash. It's trying to assemble Tron as quickly as possible and then just cast massive unfair payoffs. However, all of it hinges on assembling Tron, and a massive portion of the deck is dedicated to doing just that. First off, there is Expedition Map. It costs 1 to cast and 2 to activate, and it will tutor up any land. And notice it doesn't say basic land, so this scales perfectly. You can play a Tron land and play this turn 1. You can play a second Tron land and activate it on turn 2, and then you can find whatever Tron land you're missing, ensuring that you have access to that 7 mana on turn 3. The deck also plays Ancient Stirrings and Sylvan Scrying. Ancient Stirring lets you look at the top 5 cards to find a colorless permanent, including lands, and Sylvan Scrying will simply let you search for any piece that you're missing. So both of these are pretty great at finding Tron lands, but there is, you may notice, one fatal flaw. They have green in their mana cost, and that is very relevant because remember that your Tron lands only produce colorless mana. So if you play a forest in order to play Ancient Stirrings, then even if you find another Tron piece, you just played a forest, so you can't have full Tron until turn 4, and that's a problem. Playing green sources will slow your ability to assemble Tron because that's your land for turn. Fortunately, this deck circumvents that with Chromatic Sphere and Chromatic Star. Both of these cost colorless to cast and activate, but can produce green mana. So you can have 2 Tron lands, play a Chromatic Star to produce a green land for Sylvan Scrying, and have full Tron on turn 3 and still have access to that green mana for the Sylvan Scrying. And both of these also conveniently let you draw a card, so you don't go down a card just to have that green mana. So now that you see how consistent the deck can be at assembling Tron, let's take a look at some of the other payoffs for acquiring all of that mana. In addition to Karn Liberated, you will also frequently see Ugin the Spirit Dragon and Karn the Great Creator. Ugin is devastating because his -X ability lets you wipe the board, and since he can come down as early as turn 3 with the help of Mox Tetralite, which the deck also plays, it's a free mana on turn 3 if you can suspend it on the first turn, he doesn't have to use a ton of loyalty to wipe the board. He can come down on turn 3, I mean, maybe your opponent has a 2-drop, maybe they even have a 3-drop, so -3 wipe the board, and then he can +2 to bolt anything else that enters the battlefield. So Ugin can just take over the game as early as turn 3 or 4. The other Karn is all about utility. You basically build your entire sideboard around him, and you bring in stuff to lock down your opponents. There are even cards that are built with his static ability that turns off artifacts, and then you can turn your opponent's stuff into artifacts. It's a whole thing. But basically, Karn is just about, pulling stuff out of your sideboard to turn off your opponent's deck. The deck can also play the Worm Coil engine, Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, and Walking Ballista, so the engine is a 6/6 with lifelink and death touch, which is pretty brutal if it goes down on turn 3, which it very easily can, and even if the opponent has a kill spell for it, it just spits out 2 more tokens with 6 total power. Ulamog is just a massive game-ending threat, not much to say there, and Walking Ballista, well, you might not realize just how powerful it is. Remember that even after you assemble Tron, you can still be drawing extra copies, so this deck produces tons and tons of mana, so not only can Walking Ballista be, like a 4/4, a 5/5 when you play it, but you can activate that ability multiple times per turn. Pay 4, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It's not uncommon to be able to activate that at least twice, if not 3 times per turn. Not only does that allow Walking Ballista to just grow to massive proportions, but it can also just completely lock down the board, shooting anything down after it gets a bunch of +1/+1 counters. So those are all the threats, though do note that individual decks don't often play all of these threats. Different players have different preferences, and a lot of times the threats that Tron players play are purely based on what's popular in the metagame. So like if it's a burn metagame, Worm Coil engine might be more powerful. So you'll see Worm Coil in the main deck more often. And then if the metagame is more control focused, then the Planeswalkers might be more common in the main board. So these are all the possible threats, the most popular threats in this deck. Just keep in mind that every deck will probably play different amounts of each one, based purely on, the preference of the player. The only important thing really is that they're massive, colorless monstrosities. And by the way, the colorlessness is important because it makes Ancient Stirrings relevant in the late game. Only being able to dig 5 cards deep might not seem that great for consistency. What if you don't find the right Tron land? But remember that it finds any colorless card. So in the early game, you can use it to dig for Tron pieces, but if you top deck it in the late game, you can use it to find Karn, Ugin, Worm Coil engine, stuff like that. It's also important that they're colorless because the deck also plays All Is Dust, which wipes the board of all colored permanents. It's a one-sided board sweeper, and 7 mana sounds like a lot until you remember that this deck often has 7 mana on turn 3. So it actually comes down faster than most 4 mana board sweepers, and it's one-sided, so that's pretty good. And lastly, I don't plan to go over mana bases or sideboards with this series. I just want to give you, the brief overview of different types of decks you might see, but I do want to go over particularly noteworthy lands, and this deck does have Sanctum of Ugin in the mana base. It's pretty spicy for this deck. It produces 1 and it doesn't enter tapped, so there's no drawback. And if you cast a big threat, you can choose to sacrifice the land to find another one for funsies. So that's important if the opponent is playing counter spells. Being able to get a free extra threat to try to get through it is very useful. So that's Mono Green Tron. If you're interested in specific deck lists, check the description below. I'll leave some links to some metagame tracking websites so you can see the most up-to-date decks, as well as see different builds, because different players will have different preferences. But generally speaking, what you will see is Tron lands. You will find the tools to assemble Tron lands, and then you will see big, massive, colorless threats. Also note that this deck is not the same as Eldrazi Tron, which is a different deck that actually plays quite differently, and I will feature that in a future video. But I hope this video was useful, and if you liked it, definitely let me know below in the comments, as this is my first video in this series, and I am genuinely curious if you guys are interested in this type of video or not. I'm hoping that this is either useful if you intend to play the format, or if you're not interested in playing Modern, at least, interesting to watch. So let me know what you guys think, but in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.